For a lot of people like myself who grew up with Return to Oz, the film doesn't sit in memory as a whimsical continuation of The Wizard of Oz. It sits there as something stranger, something colder, darker, and far more unsettling than anything a child expected from a story about Oz. Because while the original film painted Oz as a vibrant dreamscape, full of music, colour, and comforting fantasy, Return to Oz strips that warmth away almost immediately. The yellow brick road is shattered, the Emerald City is empty, the world Dorothy returns to feels abandoned, as if something has quietly gone wrong in the years since she left. And for a child watching it for the first time, that shift alone created a kind of unease that was difficult to articulate. Oz was supposed to be magical, but here it feels hostile and uncanny, a place where the rules of childhood fantasy no longer feel safe. And then the Wheelers appear. For anyone who encountered them at the wrong age, the Wheelers weren't just strange villains, they were nightmare fuel for the purest of childhood senses. Their entire design feels engineered to trigger that instinctive discomfort children feel when something looks almost human but not quite right. Their limbs bend in unnatural directions, their faces are frozen in permanent grins that never change, and the way they move, rolling and scraping across the ground in chaotic bursts of motion, feels less like movement and more like something broken, forcing itself forward. They do not stalk their prey in the deliberate way movie monsters usually do. They swarm, screech, and lurch unpredictably throughout the ruins of Oz. And when you're young, that unpredictability made them feel unstoppable. They are loud, invasive, and visually bizarre in a way that sticks to the mind long after the movie ended. For a lot of us who grew up with this film, the Wheelers weren't just the scariest part of Return to Oz, they were the movie. But revisiting this film years later creates a strange kind of dissonance, because the terror simply isn't there anymore. Watching Return to Oz as an adult reveals something that childhood fear tends to hide. The film hasn't changed, but the mind that once experienced it did. The pacing feels slower, the effects feel more theatrical. The Wheelers, once these unstoppable nightmarish creatures, now look like performers in elaborate prosthetics rolling through carefully constructed sets. The dread that once felt overwhelming slowly dissolves into appreciation for the film's bizarre creativity and willingness to make their children's fantasy a genuinely eerie experience. And that transformation is what makes revisiting the movie so fascinating, because the terror of the Wheelers was never about what was on screen, it was about the imagination of the child or children watching it. As adults, we don't just see the film differently, we realize that the thing that once terrified us so deeply was as much of a product of childhood perception as it was of the movie itself. For most people, the idea of Oz is inseparable from comfort. The moment the name is mentioned, the mind automatically drifts towards the warm Technicolor fantasy of The Wizard of Oz, a film that presents its magical land as a place where danger exists but never truly feels overwhelming. Even in its darkest moments, it carries a kind of theatrical quality. Witches are dramatic rather than terrifying, flying monkeys are frightening but fleeting, and every strange encounter ultimately folds back into a sense of warmth and comforting reassurance. Oz in that story is chaotic, colourful, and whimsical, but it never stops feeling like a fairy tale designed for comfort. Because of that, anyone approaching Oz again, especially as a child, does so with certain expectations already planted in their mind. Oz is supposed to feel vibrant, it's supposed to feel welcoming, it's supposed to feel like a dream you would want to return to. Which is exactly why Return to Oz hit so differently for so many of us the first time we saw it. From its opening moments, the film quietly dismantles the safety that defined the Oz before. Instead of beginning with excitement or wonder, it begins with doubt. Dorothy's stories about Oz are no longer treated as magical memories, but as possible delusions, something adults in her world want to erase entirely. The idea that she might be subjected to electroshock therapy to cure her imagination introduces an oddly clinical kind of dread before Oz even begins to appear on screen. And when Dorothy finally does make it back to that fantasy world, the shift in tone becomes impossible to ignore. The yellow brick road lies shattered, the Emerald City is empty, the once lively land feels abandoned, like a place that has quietly collapsed in the time since Dorothy last visited. For a child expecting the same warmth and joy that defined The Wizard of Oz, this version of Oz feels wrong in a way that's difficult to articulate. It's not loud or aggressive in its darkness, it's quiet, hollow, and uncertain. And that quiet emptiness plants the first seed of fear, because when a fantasy world stops feeling safe, everything inside it can start to feel unpredictable. That tonal shift is what created the strange atmosphere surrounding Return to Oz for so many of us. The film doesn't rely on traditional horror techniques to unsettle its audience. Instead, it slowly transforms a familiar setting into something uncanny. Oz is still magical, but it's magic that feels broken, as if the rules that once made the world so joyful and enjoyable to watch has been quietly stripped away. This Dorothy wanders through ruins where lively streets should be, encountering strange new characters in a place that feels far lonelier than it ever did before. For a child watching all of this unfold, the discomfort wasn't always immediate, but it always built steadily in the background. The world itself felt unstable, like something unpredictable could emerge from it at any moment. And when that moment finally arrived, the film introduces the one element that would define its reputation for generations of young viewers. For any one of us who watched Return to Oz at the wrong age, the appearance of the Wheelers represent the exact moment the film crosses from strange into genuinely terrifying. Their introduction is deceptively simple at first. Dorothy hears noises echoing through the empty streets of the ruined Emerald City. Scraping sounds bounce off the stone walls, metallic and abrasive in a way that feels unnatural in such a quietly detached place. The camera lingers on empty corners and distant corridors just long enough to build anticipation, creating a sense that something is approaching even before the audience knows what it is. For a child watching this scene, that uncertainty becomes deeply uncomfortable. Something is clearly coming, but the film refuses to reveal it immediately, forcing the imagination to fill in the blanks. When the Wheelers finally appear, the result is something far stranger than a typical movie monster. They aren't supernatural creatures or grotesque beasts. In fact, at a glance, they resemble people, humanoid figures wearing elaborate masks and costumes. But the moment they begin to move, that familiarity collapses. Their arms and legs have been replaced with wheels, forcing their bodies into twisted shapes that seem fundamentally incompatible with normal human movement. Instead of walking or running, they roll across the ground with chaotic bursts of motion, skidding and scraping against the stone streets with a harsh metallic sound that instantly dominates the scene. Their masks remain locked in exaggerated grins that never shift regardless of what they're doing, creating a disturbing disconnect between their expressions and their behavior. They laugh, shriek, and chase Dorothy with manic energy, but their faces remain frozen in those permanent smiles, turning every movement into something deeply uncanny. For a child, this combination of design and movement was overwhelming in a way that traditional villains never really were. Children instinctively rely on visual cues to understand fictional threats. Monsters look monstrous, villains behave in predictably bad ways, and danger usually follows clear storytelling rules. The Wheelers ignored all of that. Their bodies moved unpredictably, their laughter felt chaotic, and their masks prevented any readable emotion from appearing on their faces. They did not stalk Dorothy with calculated menace, they swarm with loud, erratic energy that felt almost mechanical. The screeching of their wheels against stone amplified this effect, creating a harsh sound that makes every movement of their presence feel invasive. For a young viewer, like myself, the result was deeply unsettling. Dorothy wasn't equipped to fight them, and she can barely outrun them as they circle and close in on her. The once magical streets of Oz suddenly feel hostile, filled with creatures that don't behave according to any familiar fantasy logic. For many children who encountered the Wheelers, this sequence burned itself permanently into our memories. Not because it was violent, but because it tapped directly into the strange psychological discomfort that came from seeing something that looks almost human, yet behaves in ways that feels fundamentally wrong. Returning to Oz as an adult created a strange, disorienting experience. Because the film that once felt so terrifying for so many of us revealed itself in a completely different light. The scenes unfolded exactly as they always did, the characters behave exactly as they did before, and the Wheelers still roll across the ruined streets of Oz in the same chaotic fashion. yet the emotional reaction they produce is entirely different. The tension that once felt overwhelming simply isn't there anymore. Instead of feeling threatened by the world the film presents, you begin to notice the craftsmanship behind it, the detailed set designs, the practical effects, the elaborate costumes that give the Wheelers their bizarre appearances. The illusion that once felt so powerful began to unravel, not because the film had lost its creativity, but because the perspective of the viewer had fundamentally changed. Watching The Wheelers, and the film as a whole again as an adult, revealed details that childhood fear tends to hide or ignore. Their movement, which seemed once unpredictable and unstoppable, now clearly shows the effort of the performers balancing on specially designed wheels. Their masks, once grotesque and deeply unsettling, appear more theatrical than horrifying when viewed through a more analytical, adult lens. The sound of their wheels scraping against the ground, which once amplified the tension of the chase, now feels like part of a carefully constructed atmosphere rather than the approach of something genuinely threatening. In other words, the elements that once fueled fear began to transform into elements of appreciation. Instead of wondering how Dorothy will escape them, the mind started to admire how unusual the design is and how bold it was for a children's fantasy film to include something so visually distinct. But that transformation doesn't erase the memory of the fear itself. If anything, it highlights how powerful childhood imagination can be when it encounters something unfamiliar. The Wheelers didn't scare because of what they were on screen, they scared them because of what their minds did with that imagery afterwards. When you're young, the line between fiction and emotional reality is much thinner, allowing strange visuals to take on a much larger psychological presence than they might actually have deserved. As adults, that imaginative amplification fades, replaced by a more detached understanding of how films are made and how stories function. The Wheelers therefore become fascinating instead of frightening, and Return to Oz transforms from a source of childhood dread into a curious relic of a time when children's fantasy movies were willing to be genuinely weird and unsettling. The fear disappeared, but the memory of having been afraid will always remain. An odd reminder that sometimes the scariest movies aren't the ones designed to terrify you, but the ones you happened to encounter at exactly the wrong age. Revisiting Return to Oz as an adult ultimately reveals something fascinating about the way fear works in childhood. The film itself hasn't softened over time. Its eerie atmosphere, strange characters, and haunting imagery are all exactly as they were decades ago. If anything, its willingness to embrace such bizarre and uncomfortable ideas within a children's fantasy feels even more striking today. But the terror that once defined the experience simply isn't there anymore, because that fear never came entirely from the film itself. It came from the perspective of the child watching it, when Oz first stopped feeling safe, when the Wheelers first rolled into view with their screeching wheels and frozen smiled masks. The imagination filled every gap with possibilities, far scarier than what was actually happening on screen. And that's what makes returning to this movie so interesting now. The Wheelers no longer feel like nightmarish creatures invading a broken fantasy world. They feel like a bold, bizarre creative choice from a film that was never afraid to be strange. The fear fades, but the memory of that fear will remain, because watching Return to Oz today doesn't bring back the dread it once created, but it does create something else. A quiet appreciation for the strange magic of a film that managed to terrify an entire generation or two of kids simply by being weird enough to stick in their minds long after the credits began to roll.